To the latest after the death of an LSU sophomore earlier this month. The details are incredibly disturbing as we have learned that several people are now charged with raping Madison Brooks after a night of drinking just before she died.
The story is incredibly difficult, and we've been reporting on this now for days. The coroner has officially said that the manner of death is still under investigation, but has officially ruled that the cause of death was due to multiple traumatic injuries. Police say that the LSU sophomore had been abandoned on the side of the road by 3 men and a 17-year-old. Prosecutors say 2 of the men raped the victim while the others watched.
January 15th, 2023, 3 o'clock in the morning. Baton Rouge, Louisiana. A rideshare driver is making his way home through the stillness, the way he has 100 times before. He rounds a bend on Burbank Drive, and in the beam of his headlights, there is someone in the road. A young woman, alone. There is no time to react. The driver stops. He does not run. He calls 911 that very moment, his voice shaking as he tries to explain what he's just seen. 2 other strangers, passing through the same dark stretch of road, pull over to help. They kneel beside her. They wait for the ambulance. They do everything right, but it is already too late for the young woman on Burbank Drive. At first, it looks like a tragedy, and nothing more. A terrible accident in the dark. Wrong place, wrong time. A senseless, heartbreaking loss. Except it wasn't only an accident. Within days, investigators would pull a single piece of footage that turned this quiet subdivision into a crime scene, and turned a grieving city's questions toward 4 men, a bar in Tigerland, and the last 6 hours of a 19-year-old's life. 3 threads run through everything you are about to hear. A surveillance camera that captured more than anyone expected. A blood alcohol level nearly 4 times the legal limit. And 4 strangers who climbed into a car with her that night and left her on the side of the road. Her name was Madison Brooks. This is Crime Watch Cold Case. And this is the disturbing death of Madison Brooks. Before we go further, a word for our viewers. This is a real case involving real people and a family that is still grieving. It contains descriptions of sexual assault and of a young woman's death that some viewers may find distressing. Viewer discretion is advised. To understand how Madison ended up on that road, you have to understand where the night began. In January of 2023, Madison Brooks was a sophomore at Louisiana State University, LSU, the beating heart of Baton Rouge. And like thousands of students before her, when the weekend came, she went to Tigerland. If you've spent any time near LSU, you know the name. Tigerland is the strip of bars and clubs just off campus. Loud, crowded, the place students go to forget about exams for a few hours. And at its center that night sat a bar called Reggie's. What happened after Madison walked through its doors would become one of the most closely watched criminal cases in Louisiana in years. It would raise painful questions about consent, about who was responsible, and about how a young woman surrounded by people could end up so completely alone. And years later, it still has no ending. To tell it properly, we have to go back to the beginning, to who Madison was. Before she was a headline, before she was a case number, before her name was spoken on newscasts across the country, Madison Kennedy Brooks was a girl from Covington, Louisiana. Covington sits on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain, about 40 minutes from New Orleans. It's the kind of place where families put down roots and stay, and that's exactly what the people who loved Madison did. She was the daughter of John Brooks and Ashley Boustert, and she grew up surrounded by family. Her siblings, Aidan, Brady, and Kaylin. Her grandparents, her godparents. To her grandparents, she was their sunshine. To her friends, she was simply Maudie. Ask anyone who knew her, and the same 2 things come up again and again. Her heart and her laugh. She was just a beautiful bundle of joy. One friend said, "Really, Her laugh was so contagious. It's a phrase that turns up over and over in the memories people shared after she was gone. The laugh you could pick out across a room. The warmth that made people feel like they mattered. Madison went to St. Scholastica Academy, a private Catholic school for girls in Covington. And she didn't just pass through it. She was an honor roll student, year after year. She was a cheerleader. She was a member of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, of a group called Doves for Life, and of her school's Spirit Club. If there was something happening at St. Scholastica, a cause to support, a team to cheer for, a classmate who needed lifting up, Madison tended to be somewhere in the middle of it. Her faith was a real part of who she was, not just a box she checked. And so was showing up for other people. The friends who spoke about her later kept returning to that idea, that she was the one you could go to. She was always there for everyone, one friend said. Someone people could count on when they needed it. There was another side to her too, a fearless one. Madison loved adventure. She went skydiving. She skied. She loved traveling to new cities and collecting new experiences. The kind of person who said yes to things, who wanted to see what was out there. Her favorite color was pink, a small detail, but the kind of thing the people who love you remember. Later, at a memorial, her sorority sisters would wear pink in her honor because everyone knew it was hers. But for all the adventure, ask what mattered most to Madison, and the answer was always the same. Family. Friends, the people she loved most, and the time she spent with them. That was the center of her world. The weekly dinners, the long phone calls home, the ordinary, grounding rituals of a young woman who was close to the people who raised her. In 2021, Madison graduated from St. Scholastica, and she had her sights set on something bigger, the place a lot of Louisiana kids dream about. Louisiana State University, LSU. She arrived in Baton Rouge as a freshman and set about finding her place, and she found it fast. Madison declared a major in mass communication, and if you knew her, it fit. She loved people. She loved stories. She was drawn to the idea of using her voice to tell them. And then came the achievement that mattered most, the one that makes her loss land the hardest. Madison was accepted into the Manship School of Mass Communication at LSU. For anyone who knows the university, that acceptance carries weight. The Manship School is one of the more respected journalism and mass communication programs in the country. Getting in is competitive. It's not a given. It's something you earn. And Madison earned it. Think about what that meant to her. A future was taking shape. Journalism, storytelling, a career built around giving a voice to other people. She wanted to tell stories that mattered, stories that could make a difference. Remember that. Hold on to it, because by the time this story is over, it will mean more than it does right now. Her life at LSU wasn't only about coursework. She joined the Alpha Phi sorority, and there she found a second family. A sisterhood of young women who would later describe her exactly the way everyone else did. A pure heart, an infectious laugh, someone who lived every day to the fullest. By January of 2023, Madison Brooks was 19 years old and thriving. A sophomore at the university she'd dreamed of, in the program she'd worked to get into, surrounded by friends who loved her and a family who called her every week. She was building a future. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. And then came a Saturday night, January 14th, 2023. For Madison, it was nothing out of the ordinary. A weekend, a chance to unwind, to spend a few hours with friends the way college students do. There was no reason to think it was anything other than a normal night out. She had been on plenty of them before. She had no way of knowing it would be her last. Because in less than 12 hours, Madison Brooks would be gone, and the ordinary Saturday night she walked into would become the most scrutinized 6 hours in Louisiana, replayed on surveillance footage, argued over in courtrooms, and picked apart by a state trying to answer a single, painful question. What happened to Madison? To understand that, we have to follow her into Tigerland, a cluster of bars and clubs just off the LSU campus. Loud, crowded, the place students go on a weekend to let go of the week. And on the night of January 14th, 2023, one of those students was Madison Brooks. She walked into a bar called Reggie's for what should have been an ordinary night out. Nothing about it was meant to be remarkable. But somewhere in that same crowd were 4 young men Madison had never met. Casen Carver, 18. Kaivon Washington, also 18. Everett Lee, 28, the oldest of the group and Washington's uncle. And a 4th, a 17-year-old, later identified as Desmond Carter. This is the detail to hold on to, because everything that follows turns on it. Madison did not know these men. By their own account, they had never met her before that night. They were strangers, sharing the same room on the same evening, until their paths crossed in a way that would end in tragedy. And almost all of it was caught on camera. Reggie's had surveillance running that night, and after Madison's death, investigators would examine that footage frame by frame. What it showed became the backbone of their case, because over the course of the night, the cameras captured something painful to watch. A young woman's condition steadily coming apart. Investigators say the footage shows Madison and the 17-year-old hugging and dancing. And then, as the hours passed, the deterioration. Around 1 in the morning, the affidavit says, Madison was sitting on a stool when she stood to readjust her clothing and stumbled backward and had to be helped to her feet by 3 different people. Later, near the entrance of the bar, she fell again. The 17-year-old is seen approaching her, removing her baseball cap, and Madison grabbing his hand as she pulls herself back up. This is the picture the cameras painted, not of a woman in control of her night, but of someone who was struggling to stand. By every account, including the men's own statements to police, Madison appeared visibly drunk. She was falling over. She was slurring her words. She was, in the words of one of the men, incapable of standing on her own. At 1:49 in the morning, Madison left Reggie's, and she was not alone. Surveillance footage shows her leaving with the 4 men. In that final clip, the 4 are seen crossing the street toward a parking lot, and a young woman, who appears to be Madison, is seen jogging behind them, trying to catch up. It is the last known footage of her alive. By 1:54 a.m., 5 minutes later, the group was seen getting into a car. According to the men's statements, Madison had asked them for a ride home. Think about what that means. Madison didn't know these men. She didn't know where she was being taken. And by their own description of her state, she was in no condition to make a safe decision about anything. But she got into the vehicle, Carver behind the wheel, Everett Lee in front, and in the back seat, Madison, Kaivon Washington, and the 17-year-old. The car pulled away from Reggie's, and a short distance later, it stopped. Carver told detectives he parked on a nearby street. He said he asked Madison for her address so he could take her home, but that she fell over and couldn't answer him. And it was there, parked on that quiet residential street, that prosecutors say a crime took place. Here I'm going to choose my words carefully, out of respect for Madison and her family. Investigators allege that Washington and the 17-year-old sexually assaulted Madison in the back seat of that car, while, prosecutors say, Carver recorded a portion of what happened on his phone. That is what the state alleges. I'm not going to narrate it beyond that. What matters for this story is not the detail, it's the question the whole case would come to hang on. And that question is consent. Because the men's defense, from the very beginning, was a single word: she agreed. According to the affidavit, one of them claimed the 17-year-old asked Madison 5 times to have sex, and that she said yes. Consent, they argued. She consented. But here is where that argument runs into a wall, and it's worth slowing down, because this is the legal heart of everything you're watching. Under Louisiana law, Consent isn't only about whether someone says the word yes. It's about whether they're capable of meaningfully giving it in the first place. If a person is so impaired, so intoxicated, that they cannot understand what's happening or make a rational decision, then in the eyes of the law, they cannot consent. It doesn't matter what words come out. And crucially, the law asks whether the other people involved knew or should have known that the person was that impaired. So the entire case turns on a simple collision. The men said Madison agreed, but had they already admitted she was too far gone to agree to anything? Carver told deputies that Madison consented, but in the same breath, he admitted she was too impaired to give proper consent. When investigators asked him directly whether Madison was too drunk to consent to sex, his answer was 2 words: "I guess." He would tell police that what happened made him uncomfortable, that he hated it, but that he did nothing to stop it. Hold that contradiction in your mind, because a courtroom will spend years wrestling with it. When it was over, the men said Madison asked to be taken home, and they drove her to a subdivision called Pelican Lakes, off a road named Burbank Drive. But this was not Madison's neighborhood. It was an unfamiliar area, more than 3 miles from the bar. A dark residential stretch she didn't know. And there, sometime before 3 o'clock in the morning, they let her out of the car, and they drove away. Madison Brooks was left alone, in the dark, in a place she'd never been. We now know just how impaired she was, because the hospital would measure it. Madison's blood alcohol concentration was 0.319. In Louisiana, the legal limit to drive is 0.08. Madison's level was nearly 4 times that, high enough, deputies noted, to cause alcohol poisoning and to render a person unconscious. At that level, medical experts say a person can lose the ability to reason, to recognize danger, to understand where they are or how to get to safety. And that is the state Madison was in when the car's taillights disappeared down the street. What happened next? No camera captured. Somehow, in the darkness, Madison made her way from that subdivision toward Burbank Drive, a wide 4-lane highway, and somehow she ended up in the middle of it. At 2:50 in the morning, an emergency call came in. A woman had been struck by a car on Burbank Drive, and now we're back where we began. The empty road, the rideshare driver rounding the bend, the headlights, a driver who was not impaired, who stopped immediately, who called for help. Strangers kneeling on the pavement, trying to save a life that couldn't be saved. Only now you understand what those first responders didn't yet know. That the young woman on Burbank Drive hadn't simply wandered into the road by chance. That the last 6 hours of her life had a trail, a bar, a car, 4 strangers, and a question of consent that a state would spend years trying to answer. When the sun came up over Baton Rouge, investigators thought they were looking at a traffic fatality. They had no idea what they were about to find. When the sun came up over Baton Rouge on Sunday, January 15th, the East Baton Rouge Sheriff's Office was looking at what appeared to be a traffic fatality. A young woman struck by a car on a dark highway before dawn. Tragic, senseless, but, on its face, an accident. Then the question started, because the facts didn't sit right. Why was a 19-year-old LSU student standing in the middle of Burbank Drive, a 4-lane highway more than 3 miles from campus, at nearly 3 in the morning? Where had she come from? How did she get all the way out there? And who had she been with before she ended up alone in that road? To answer those questions, investigators did what good investigators do. They started pulling video. They canvassed the businesses along Madison's path, gathering surveillance footage, working backward through her night. And that trail led them to Tigerland, to a bar called Reggie's. What they saw on that footage changed everything. Investigators watched Madison over the course of the night, and they watched her condition fall apart. Around 1 in the morning, seen stumbling, needing help to get back on her feet. They watched her leave the bar behind 4 men she'd apparently just met, jogging to keep up. This was no longer the picture of a random accident. This was the last known movement of a young woman who, by the video's own account, was in no condition to protect herself, walking off into the night with strangers. The forensic findings deepened the concern. Toxicology came back with Madison's blood alcohol level at .319, nearly 4 times the legal limit to drive, high enough to cause alcohol poisoning or unconsciousness. A sexual assault examination was performed on Madison's body, and its findings would become central to what came next. The official cause of death was ruled to be the traumatic injuries she suffered when she was struck by the car. But investigators now believed those final minutes on Burbank Drive were the end of a chain of events that started hours earlier, in the back seat of a parked vehicle. So they went to work. They identified the 4 men from the surveillance footage. They tracked the vehicle. They pieced the timeline together, minute by minute. The bar, the parking lot, the car, the drop-off, the road. And once they had it, they moved. On Sunday, a 17-year-old was booked into juvenile detention. Then, on Monday, January 23rd, the adults were taken into custody. According to the sheriff's office, the 4 turned themselves in. And with that, a story that had been a quiet local tragedy detonated across LSU, across Baton Rouge, and soon across the entire country. The men gave statements. And those statements are a large part of why the case looked the way it did. Carver, the driver, admitted the basics, that he and his friends had been drinking at the bar, that none of them had ever met Madison before that night. He described her condition in unsparing terms, falling over, slurring her words, unable to stand on her own. And yet he maintained she had consented. When investigators pressed him on whether she was simply too drunk to agree to anything, he gave that now infamous 2-word answer, "I guess." He said the encounter had made him uncomfortable. He said he hated it. But he acknowledged he did nothing to stop it. The others said less. Washington denied wrongdoing, and when investigators asked him to provide a DNA sample, he requested an attorney and ended the interview. Everett Lee, the oldest of the group, confirmed he was there, but offered little. And the 17-year-old's statements were sealed because he was a juvenile. Based on the surveillance footage, the toxicology, the medical findings, and the men's own words, the sheriff's office filed charges. And the specific charges matter because they tell you how prosecutors saw each man's role. Kaivon Washington and the 17-year-old were each charged with 3rd-degree rape, the 2 accused of the assault itself. Casen Carver and Everett Lee were charged as principals to 3rd-degree rape, meaning prosecutors alleged they were present and part of what happened, even if they didn't directly commit the act. Under Louisiana law, that principal charge is important and counterintuitive to a lot of people. You can be charged in connection with a rape even if you never touched the victim, if the state believes you helped it happen or were a knowing participant in the events. It's a legal theory that would sit at the center of this case for years. A judge set bond for the 3 adults, $50,000 for Carver, $75,000 for Lee, and $150,000 for Washington. Carver and Lee posted bond and walked out to await trial. Washington remained behind bars. Those released were placed under house arrest, fitted with ankle monitors, and barred from posting about the case online. And these were only the initial charges. In the weeks to come, they would grow far more serious. But while the legal machinery turned, a community was grieving. Across the LSU campus, students held vigils. Candles were lit along the 8800 block of Burbank Drive, near where Madison died. A memorial grew. Flowers, notes, a place to mourn. LSU's president, William Tate, issued a statement calling Madison an amazing young woman with limitless potential who should not have been taken this way. What happened to her was evil, he wrote, and our legal system will parcel out justice. But he turned much of his message toward underage drinking, and the bars that serve minors. And that choice drew sharp backlash. Student groups accused him of shifting blame onto Madison because she'd been drinking, saying victims should never be blamed for what was done to them. It was an early sign of a fault line that would run through this entire case, the question of where responsibility truly belonged. And then there was the detail that captured who Madison was, even in death. Her sorority revealed that Madison had been an organ donor, that her heart and her kidneys were donated to save the lives of others. Even at the end, she gave life. Her sisters called her a hero. But heroism and heartbreak wouldn't answer the question the state now had to face, because within weeks, this case was about to crack wide open, with new charges, new allegations, and revelations that would make national headlines all over again. In the weeks after the arrests, the case against these four men didn't just hold, it grew. On February 22, 2023, an East Baton Rouge grand jury took up the case of the youngest defendant, the 17-year-old, now publicly named as Desmond Carter. And the grand jury did something significant. It charged him as an adult, and it upgraded his charge to first-degree rape, the most serious sexual assault charge available under Louisiana law. A charge that carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Why the jump from third degree to first? It comes down to a specific feature of Louisiana law. First-degree rape can apply when two or more offenders are alleged to have participated in the crime. And that's exactly what prosecutors alleged happened in the back seat of that car. The involvement of more than one person is what elevated it to the gravest charge on the books. Carter was first. He would not be the last. In May, the grand jury indicted Casen Carver, the driver, and upgraded his charge as well, from principal to third-degree rape all the way up to first-degree rape, along with third-degree rape. Carver, remember, was not accused of assaulting Madison himself, but under Louisiana's principal theory, prosecutors argued he was legally responsible for what happened in his car, and he would later also face a charge of video voyeurism, tied to the allegation that part of the encounter was recorded. Kaivon Washington was indicted too, on first-degree rape and video voyeurism in Madison's case. As for Everett Lee, the oldest of the group, the grand jury did not indict him. His role would remain a lingering, unresolved thread in the case. For Madison's mother, Ashley Boustert, the escalating charges brought a complicated kind of relief. "I'm pleased with the indictment," she said, "but as a mother who just lost her child, it's still a tough pill to swallow." She said she remained confident that justice would prevail. And then the case took a darker turn, one that reached far beyond that single night in January. As Madison's story dominated the news, investigators and reporters began taking a closer look at one of the men charged in her case, Kaivon Washington. And what surfaced was disturbing. Washington was indicted in two additional, entirely separate rape cases. One in East Baton Rouge Parish, tied to an incident in 2022 that also named a co-defendant, and one in Livingston Parish involving a victim who was a child. "I'm going to leave those two cases right there, stated plainly and factually, out of respect for the people involved. They are separate matters. They are allegations. And it's important to be clear. Kaivon Washington has not been convicted in those cases, just as he has not been convicted in Madison's. But their emergence changed the texture of this story, because suddenly the public was looking not at one alleged incident, but at a young man facing three. Meanwhile, the defense was mounting an aggressive fight of its own, and their central weapon, they believed, was video. Just days after the arrests, the attorneys representing the accused men held a press conference near the courthouse in downtown Baton Rouge. Their message was defiant. Their clients were innocent. This was a tragedy, they said, not a crime. One of the attorneys, Ron Haley, argued that the two men who had sex with Madison did so after what he called verbal consent, and that Madison had left the car on her own, saying she would get an Uber. The defense pointed to video they said would exonerate their clients. Footage, they claimed, showing that Madison was not in the incapacitated state prosecutors described. They were confident that video would win the case. But when that footage actually made its way into a courtroom, it did not do what the defense had promised. At a bond hearing, Judge Brad Myers reviewed the video taken inside the car, along with the surveillance footage from Reggie's. And his reaction was not what the defense had hoped for. The judge described the men on that video as callously laughing at Madison, a young woman, visibly impaired, and slurring her words. His conclusion was blunt. The evidence made clear to him that a crime had occurred that night. It was a stunning reversal. The very piece of evidence the defense believed would set their clients free had, in the eyes of the judge, done the opposite. So the defense changed tactics, and this next move would spark one of the longest legal battles of the entire case. The defense sought to introduce Madison's prior sexual history. They argued it was relevant, that it could offer an alternate explanation for physical findings, or for the absence of certain evidence. Prosecutors fought back hard, and here they invoked one of the most important protections in American sexual assault law, the rape shield. Rape shield laws exist for a simple reason. For generations, defense strategies in these cases often amounted to putting the victim on trial, parading their past relationships in front of a jury to suggest that a person with a sexual history couldn't really be assaulted. Rape shield rules were designed to stop that. Under Louisiana law, a victim's sexual history is generally treated as irrelevant and inadmissible, precisely because it invites a jury to judge the person rather than the facts. The trial court sided with the prosecution. Madison's history could not be used. The defense appealed, and an appeals court agreed, ruling that her sexual history was not applicable to the rape charges. The fight went all the way to the Louisiana Supreme Court, which, in a unanimous decision, upheld that ruling, finding that the right to present a defense does not require a court to admit irrelevant evidence. Madison's past would not be weaponized against her, but that legal victory for the prosecution pointed to a much harder problem, one that helps explain why, years later, this case still has no ending. Because for all the surveillance footage, all the statements, all the public attention, the prosecution faced a genuine evidentiary challenge. Sources indicated that no DNA from the suspects was recovered from Madison. And that raises a difficult question. How do you prove a rape beyond a reasonable doubt without that kind of forensic evidence? The state's case would have to rest on other things. On Madison's condition, captured on camera, on the video from inside the car, on the men's own words, including Carver's admission that Madison was too impaired to truly consent. It's a case built on impairment and capacity rather than on physical trace evidence, and that makes it harder to prove and easier to contest. The district attorney, Hiller Moore, acknowledged the weight his office carried, emphasizing that the defendants are presumed innocent and that the burden of proof rests entirely with the state. And so a case that had exploded across the country in a matter of weeks settled into something slower and grinding and painful. The charges were as serious as Louisiana law allows. The evidence was real but contested, and the people who loved Madison were about to learn just how long the road to a verdict could be. Because from here, the story stops being about that single night and becomes about the years of legal warfare that followed. For Madison's family, the hardest part of what came next wasn't a courtroom loss. It was the waiting, because in the years after her death, this case became less a trial and more a war of attrition, and much of that war was fought over a single question: who would even be allowed to judge it? The trial of Casen Carver landed before Judge Gail Horn Ray, a judge whose own son is a convicted serial rapist. That fact alone raised eyebrows, but what turned it into a full-blown legal battle was something else. Text messages surfaced from Carver's family, describing the judge as friendly to their side. one message suggesting she would know to help them. Prosecutors moved to have her removed. A judge agreed, recusing her to protect public confidence in the case. But that was far from the end of it. The question of whether Judge Ray should stay or go bounced through Louisiana's appellate courts for months. Reassigned, appealed, reconsidered. An appeals court agreed a different judge should take over in the interest of justice, even while finding no actual proof of bias. And then, finally, the state's highest court had its say. In June of 2026, the Louisiana Supreme Court declined to rehear the prosecutor's request to remove her. Judge Ray would remain on the case. It was the kind of procedural fight that, to a grieving family, must have felt like watching justice disappear into paperwork. So let me tell you where this case actually stands. As of the making of this video, Casen Carver's trial has been reset for November 16th. He waived his right to a jury, which means a judge alone will decide his fate on charges of first-degree rape, third-degree rape, and video voyeurism. Kaivon Washington's case remains pending, as do his two separate cases. Desmond Carter's case is pending as well, and Everett Lee, the oldest of the group, was never indicted by a grand jury. More than 3 years after Madison Brooks died, here is the plain, uncomfortable truth. There have been no convictions in her case. Not one. Everything you've heard remains, in the eyes of the law, an allegation. And every one of these men is presumed innocent unless and until that changes. But the reckoning over Madison's death was never only about those men. Remember where the night began. At Reggie's, the bar in Tigerland. Within days of Madison's death, state authorities issued an emergency suspension of the bar's license to serve alcohol, citing a potential threat to public safety. Reggie's was fined, its liquor license revoked, and it shut its doors permanently. The site where Madison's last night began was left empty, and Madison's father wanted a fuller accounting. In September of 2023, John Brooks filed a sweeping wrongful death lawsuit, naming not just the 4 men, but Reggie's owner and its staff, and the rideshare company and its driver. In that suit, Madison's parents allege the bar handed their underage daughter an over 21 wristband and served her 24 drinks the night she died. It's a civil case, still working its way through the courts, an attempt to answer a question the criminal charges can't fully address. How many people had a chance to change what happened that night, and didn't? That's the question that has made this case resonate so far beyond Baton Rouge. Because Madison Brooks was surrounded by people, in the bar, in the car, on that road, and she still ended up alone. But her family has refused to let her be remembered only as a cautionary tale. In her memory, they created the Madison Brooks Foundation. There is a scholarship in her name, one that supports students at the very place she'd fought her way into, the Manship School of Mass Communication. Her mother, Ashley Boustert, has become a public voice, carrying her daughter's case to lawmakers and refusing to let it fade from view. And that brings us back to something from the very beginning of this story. Madison wanted to tell stories that mattered. That was the whole reason she chased her way into that journalism program, to give a voice to people who needed one. She never got the chance. Instead, her name became the story. And the scholarship that bears it now helps other young people do the very thing she dreamed of doing. This case leaves us with questions that don't have clean answers. What does consent mean when someone is too impaired to give it? What do we owe a stranger who is in trouble right in front of us? And how do we keep the people around us safe on an ordinary night out that should never have ended the way this one did? Those questions are still being argued, in courtrooms, on campuses, and in a community that hasn't stopped grieving. We're not here to tell you how a jury or a judge should rule. That's not our place. That process is still unfolding, and it deserves to unfold on the evidence. What we can tell you is this: behind every case number and every headline was a real person, a daughter, a sister, a friend, a young woman with a pure heart and an infectious laugh, who lived every day to the fullest, and who was loved. Her name was Madison Kennedy Brooks, and her story isn't finished being told. If you'd like to follow this case as it moves toward trial, consider subscribing, and we'd ask you to do one thing. As you watch it unfold, follow the facts and let the process work. This is Crime Watch Cold Case. Thank you for watching.